In the high desert of the American West, a prairie dog can die in its burrow without anyone noticing. The grass keeps moving. The wind keeps dragging dust across the ground. Above it, the land looks quiet, almost empty. But under the surface, inside fleas no bigger than a grain of sand, one of the most feared killers in human history can still be alive. Its name is Yersinia pestis. Most people know it by another name, plague. And that is where the story becomes difficult to hold in your mind. Because plague is supposed to belong to the Middle Ages. It is supposed to live in paintings of hooded doctors, in old city walls, in mass graves, in the dark space between history and legend. It is the disease we imagine as finished, sealed away by time, left behind with wooden carts and church bells, and streets no one had the strength to clean. But the bacterium did not vanish. Today, plague still lives mainly in small mammals and the fleas that feed on them. It can pass between animals for years without ever touching a human being. And sometimes, when the wrong flea bites the wrong host, the past breaks through. In the United States, the number is small now, almost strangely small compared with the terror the word still carries. In recent decades, health officials have reported an average of about 7 human plague cases a year. 7. In a country of more than 330 million people. A number so low it sounds almost harmless. But numbers can lie when they are too small, just as easily as when they are too large. Because this is not a story about a disease that rules the world anymore. It is a story about a disease that learned how to wait. So here is the question. If the first Black Death wave passed more than 650 years ago, why is its killer still here? To understand why that question matters, we have to go back to the moment Europe first realized something terrible had arrived. In October of 1347, ships from the Black Sea reached the Sicilian port of Messina. Accounts describe sailors already dead or dying, their bodies marked by fever, weakness, and painful swellings that appeared in the neck, armpits, and groin. People did not yet know about bacteria. They did not know about fleas moving between animals and humans. They did not know that a microscopic organism could turn a busy port into a doorway for disaster. They only knew that death had come in with the ships. From there, the disease moved with terrifying speed. It spread through ports, roads, markets, monasteries, farms, and cities. It followed trade, but it also followed people running from it. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death tore through Europe with a force that still almost defies belief. The exact death toll will never be known. A common estimate is that about 25 million people died in Europe alone. In some regions, 1 person in 3 disappeared. In others, the number may have been closer to 1 in 2. Imagine every 3rd door on your street closed forever. Then imagine every 2nd door. Now imagine that happening not in one village, but across a continent. There were not enough priests to hear the last confessions, not enough grave diggers to bury the bodies, not enough workers to harvest the fields. In some places, wages rose because labor had become rare. In others, whole families vanished so quickly that their homes were left standing with no one inside to claim them. The Black Death was not simply an outbreak. It was a break in the rhythm of civilization. And yet, for centuries, the story seemed simple enough. A disease had arrived. It had burned through Europe. Then, slowly, that first terrible wave had passed. But that simple story was never the whole truth. For a long time, the Black Death was explained with a clean, almost mechanical chain of events. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried plague. Ships carried rats. Cities carried the dead. It was simple, memorable, and partly true. Yersinia pestis is a zoonotic bacterium, which means it normally lives in animals and can spill over into humans. Fleas are one of its main bridges. When an infected flea bites a person, the bacterium can enter the body and move into the lymph nodes. Those swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, gave bubonic plague its name. That part of the story is real. But real does not always mean complete. Plague can also spread through direct contact with infected animal tissue. In its pneumonic form, when it infects the lungs, it can move through respiratory droplets from one person to another. That means the medieval disaster was not just a cartoon line from rat to flea to human. It was a living system of animals, insects, ships, climate, trade, cities, bodies, and fear. And that system was moving through a world that had almost no protection. There were no antibiotics, no microscopes powerful enough to reveal the cause, no germ theory. The first practical microscopes were still more than 2 centuries away. The idea that specific invisible organisms could cause specific diseases would not become a foundation of medicine until the 19th century. So, medieval people tried to explain the plague with the tools they had: bad air, angry planets, poisoned wells, divine punishment, broken moral order. Some of those explanations sound strange now, but they were attempts to make sense of something no one could see. The truth was smaller than dust and more dangerous than an army. Still, even after modern science identified the bacterium, one mystery remained. Where had this killer really come from? And how long had it been moving through the world before Europe finally gave it a name? The old story had a neat shape. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried plague. Ships carried rats. Cities carried the dead. But real epidemics are rarely that clean. The rat story explained part of the Black Death, but it could not explain everything. In many medieval records, there are descriptions of human suffering, but not always clear reports of massive rat die-offs. The disease also moved with a speed that made researchers ask whether rats were the only bridge. Some models point to another possibility. Human fleas and body lice may have helped carry plague from person to person during the second pandemic. That does not erase rats from the story. It makes the story larger. What if the Black Death was more complicated than the simple chain we were taught? The first major crack came not from a diary or a church record. It came from teeth. Inside a tooth, blood vessels and soft tissue can leave behind tiny traces of the microbes that were in a person's body when they died. In 2011, scientists reconstructed a genome of Yersinia pestis from Black Death victims buried in London. The remains were securely dated to 1348 to 1350, right in the heart of the first Great Wave. The genome was not a guess. It was recovered at about 30-fold average coverage, strong enough for researchers to compare it with modern plague strains. And what they found changed the story. The medieval bacterium sat very close to the root of plague strains linked to human infection today. If you are enjoying stories where one small piece of evidence changes how we understand history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because the next clue takes us far from London, to graves already waiting before Europe knew what was coming. Near Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan, there are medieval cemeteries that once looked like a local mystery. The tombstones carried dates, 1338 and 1339. That was almost a decade before the disease reached Sicily in 1347. Some inscriptions named the cause of death as pestilence. For a long time, that word was haunting, but vague. Then geneticists tested the dead. In 2022, researchers reported ancient DNA from 7 people exhumed from 2 cemeteries, Karajigach and Burana. They found Yersinia pestis. Not a rumor of plague, not a later legend, the bacterium itself. The discovery did not map every step of the journey west. It did not show the exact ship, road, flea, rodent, or trader that carried plague toward Europe. History is rarely that generous, but it did something as important. It placed a DNA-backed clue near the early source of the Second Plague pandemic in Central Eurasia. Before the Black Death became Europe's nightmare, the bacterium had already been moving through another world, leaving traces in graves far from the cities that would later become famous for dying. The Black Death was no longer only a disaster with a date. It was a branch in a bacterial family tree. Geneticists could compare ancient plague genomes with modern ones and ask how they were related. Which strains came before? Which came after? Where did the branches split? The answer was not a single straight line. It was a pattern of movement, survival, and diversification. The London genome showed that the Black Death strain stood close to the roots of many plague strains associated with human infection today. The Kyrgyzstan genomes pointed toward Central Eurasia as a key early source of the pandemic's expansion. So, the title's mystery begins to answer itself. The Black Death was not just a medieval event that appeared out of nowhere, burned through Europe, and disappeared. It was one chapter in a much older story of a bacterium that had been moving through animals, landscapes, and trade routes before Europeans gave it a name. And the next question was even more personal. If plague carried its history inside its DNA, did the survivors still carry part of that history inside theirs? By the time geneticists had compared the ancient plague genomes, the Black Death was no longer only a medieval disaster. It had become something stranger, a biological event with 2 sets of evidence. One was inside the bacterium. The other may have been inside us. For centuries, historians could count the dead. They could read burial records, city laws, and monastery chronicles, but they could not see what survival had done to the bodies of the living. Then, ancient DNA gave scientists a way to ask a new question. Not only who died, but who survived. And did survival leave a mark? In 2022, researchers studied DNA from 206 ancient human remains from European populations before, during, and after the Black Death. They focused on immune-related genes, the parts of the body's defense system that decide how strongly a person responds when something dangerous enters the blood. One gene drew special attention, ERAP2. In the original study, certain versions of that gene appeared to become more common after the plague. In lab tests, cells carrying one version seemed better at helping the immune system respond to Yersinia pestis. The Black Death may not have only changed cities, labor, religion, and economies. It may have changed the genetic future of the people who lived through it. But this is where the story has to slow down. Science is not a single voice. It is an argument with evidence. Later, researchers challenged how strong that evidence really was. They argued that the signal of natural selection after the Black Death may be weaker than first reported, and that ancient DNA can be distorted by small samples, damaged material, and the difficulty of comparing people across centuries. So the honest answer is not that the Black Death definitely rewrote the human immune system. The honest answer is more careful and maybe more interesting. It may have. The case is still being tested, and if survival came with a price, what else did the plague leave behind? the answer is not only in human DNA, it is also in the dirt. It lives in wild rodents, in fleas, in burrows, in grasslands, in mountain valleys, in places where no one is writing history down. Humans are not its main home. We are its accident. Today, the World Health Organization describes plague as a disease found on every continent except Oceania. Most human cases since the 1990s have been reported in Africa, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, and Peru are among the countries where plague remains most established. Between 2010 and 2015, more than 3,200 human plague cases were reported worldwide, with 584 deaths. That is not the Black Death. That is not half a continent falling silent. But it is also not extinction. It is the old pattern in a smaller form: an animal reservoir, a flea, a human contact, a fever that looks ordinary until it is not. The scale has changed because medicine changed. The ecology has not. In the United States, plague remains rare. In recent decades, the average has been about 7 human cases a year, mostly in the West. More than 80% of those cases have been bubonic plague, the form most people associate with swollen lymph nodes and flea bites. And here is the difference between the 14th century and now. Today, plague can usually be treated with antibiotics if it is caught early. Early diagnosis can save lives. Modern medicine changed the ending for many patients, but it did not erase the bacterium. The Black Death ended as a historical wave, but plague, as a living organism, did not end at all. This is why the new genetic story matters. For a long time, the Black Death was treated like a closed chapter, a disaster from the past, a medieval horror, a reminder of how helpless people were before modern medicine. But ancient DNA changed the shape of that story. It showed that the killer was real, specific, and traceable. It showed that the bacterium had a family tree with ancient branches and living relatives. It pointed back beyond Europe, toward Central Eurasia, where graves from 1338 and 1339 carried clues to the pandemic before Europe knew what was coming. And it raised the possibility that plague did not only pass through human history, it may have pressed against human evolution itself. That does not make the Black Death more supernatural. It makes it more real. The old story was a line. Plague appeared. Plague killed. Plague vanished. The new story is a web. Rodents, fleas, trade routes, climate, cities, immune systems, graves, genomes, and living reservoirs. A web that stretched across continents, crossed centuries, and still has not fully broken. That is the deeper lesson. Pandemics do not always end in the clean way history books make them seem to end. The emergency passes. The bodies are buried. The cities rebuild. But sometimes the organism remains, hidden in another host, waiting for the world to give it another opening. So the Black Death was never only a story about death. It was a story about movement. A bacterium moving through animals, fleas moving between bodies, ships moving across seas, traders moving across routes older than nations, genes moving from the dead into the questions of the living. And in the end, the most frightening thing ancient DNA revealed was not that the Black Death was mysterious. It was understandable. Not a curse, not a shadow, not some medieval nightmare sealed behind us forever. A bacterium, small enough to vanish inside a flea, powerful enough to empty cities, old enough to have a history before the Black Death, persistent enough to still exist after it. It never needed to rule the world forever. It only needed to survive somewhere. And it did.